Why did you do that? Why did you do that? That's a question that I'm sure has rung in your ears from time to time. Maybe it was voiced by you, maybe it was voiced by somebody else. And whenever that question is raised, it's usually raised with a hint of agitation, no doubt peppered with inevitable annoyance. And here's why. Because by the time you ask the question, it's too late. Someone's already made up their mind, and there was a decision made that missed the mark. See, the question was raised because you missed the bigger, better picture. The question is raised because you made a decision, but you forgot to think about the people around you. You forgot to think about where your life was going. You forgot to think about the future you had dreamed of. You forgot to think about the people that you say you love. You forgot to look up. Why did you do that? It's a question that's usually asked too late, and we don't have a good answer for. You know that every day we make 35,000 decisions. 35,000. Now, if we were to get our 8 hours of sleep like we're supposed to get, that means that we're making 2,187 decisions every hour we're awake. And it only takes one bad one for that question to ring in your ears again. Why did you do that? See, it only takes one time you forget to think about the bigger, better picture for trouble to start to mount. We need to be able to make good decisions, God-honoring decisions. And so our passage this morning, found in Romans chapter 12, verse 1 and 2, is going to help us understand what we need to know to make good decisions. Turn with me to Romans chapter 12. And we're going to read the first two verses. We're going to focus in mainly on verse 1 today, but we're going to be in these two verses for the next couple of weeks. Let's just read this passage together. It says this: "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will." You know, to make a good decision, we need to look up. And we need to have a view of where it is we're going. Now, we might have a lot of opinions in life about what that view is, what that view could be. And you have one in your mind right now. So let me ask you this question. Just how far is that view? Is that view as big as it could be, as big as it should be? Is it that bigger, better picture? Because we don't want to speculate about this. I mean, we don't want just a wild guess on what this view should be. And so Paul, in Romans chapter 12, he gives us this ultimate, larger-than-life view. And this is what it is: to please God. That's the view. That's it. That's the bigger, better view, to please God. And we can see that at least 2 times in these verses, Paul uses the word pleasing. In verse 12, verse 1, he says that we live a life of sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. And then at the end of verse 2, he says that we would know God's will, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. The first and ultimate decision that we need to make is who it is we're going to look to. That's the first and ultimate decision. And so Paul urges us in verse 1, "Therefore I urge you." Okay, he's pleading with us, he's begging with us that our view isn't a narrow view that's focused just on ourselves, just on our own self-interests. That it isn't a view with blinders on, unable to see beyond ourselves. See, the first and ultimate decision is whether or not you're going to live a life that pleases God. The first and ultimate decision you're going to make is the decision to have that view. See, that's the view that we need. That's it. And Paul is pleading, begging with us to have that view. David in Psalm chapter 19, verse 14 said this, "May the words of my mouth and may the meditations of my heart be pleasing to you, Lord, my rock, my redeemer." You know, David is saying, okay, that's the view that we need. I want my life to be pleasing to God. That's the view I'm going to have. I'm going to look up to that. Paul to the church in Ephesus in Ephesians 5:10 simply says, find out what pleases God. Find out what pleases God. That's the view that we need. That's the view. And a life that pleases God demands decisions that do. A life that pleases God demands decisions that do. See, if we made that first and ultimate choice, to live a life that is pleasing to God, then all the little choices, all the little decisions that we make through our life, through each day, should reflect that. It should verify that. And there's going to be many, many of those decisions every day. One of the things that I get to do in my ministry is I get to do hockey chaplaincy. And for the last few years, I've been the hockey chaplain for a local hockey team and an Ontario Hockey League team. And this is a feeder league to the NHL, and I've seen a lot of my players that I've worked with attain that ultimate goal to be in the NHL. A couple of years ago, one of our players hit the NHL. He now plays for the Carolina Hurricanes, and he was just a superstar, an incredible player. I mean, definitely he had God-given gifts to be able to play hockey. But there's something else that just set him apart. See, all the players that I meet say, I want to make the NHL. That is my goal. That's the ultimate decision that I'm making. But very few of them make it. And at least with this player, who's now with Carolina, the one thing that was very different about him was, he had made that decision, I'm going to play in the NHL. But every little decision he made in his life just verified that. I mean, every decision he made was pointing to that bigger choice. How he practiced, how often he practiced, how hard he practiced, what he would put in his body, what he would choose to do off the ice, who he would hang out with, who he wouldn't hang out with. Every little decision he made only verified that ultimate choice, that view of hitting what they call the show and playing in the NHL. See, and for us, if we've made that first and ultimate decision to live a life that pleases God, then every decision we make should simply verify that, should simply point to that. And there's going to be many of those decisions. And so Paul, in Romans chapter 12, verse 1, he highlights for us some of these other critical decisions we need to make to ensure that one is met, that big ultimate one is met. And so in Romans chapter 12, verse 1, Paul starts with this. Therefore. Okay, first word of that verse, therefore. See, a life that pleases God demands decisions that do. It demands the decision to feed your mind with truth. That is the truth of who God is. Now, you might ask me, you got that from one word? I mean, you got all that from one word? Therefore? Well, when we study the Bible And when you study your Bible at home, there's a question that we learn to ask. And maybe you've heard it. And it simply says, whenever you read in the Bible the word therefore, you need to ask the question, what is therefore there for? Okay. What is the therefore there for? And when we read the word therefore, what is typically happening is there's going to be an application made now. There's going to be a conclusion based on truth that had already had been spoken and revealed. So there's this backfilling of truth. And now because of this truth, there's going to be an application. There's going to be some sort of a conclusion made. And we often read that word therefore in the major prophets. And that word is used all the time in the major prophets. You know, men like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, these men who spoke for God. I mean, they say this all the time because in speaking for God, okay, God is saying some things. And he's speaking truth. And he's often talking about the condition, the heart condition of his people. And so he speaks the truth, and because of this truth, this and this is going to happen. Okay, because of this truth, this backfilling of truth, there's this conclusion, there's this application that now needs to be made. In the book of Romans, you will see the word therefore kind of scattered throughout the book, here and there. But when we read the word therefore in chapter 12, verse 1, okay, that needs to be capitalized. Because that word therefore represents a shift in the book. Okay, this is a shift in what's happening in the book. It's a foundational shift from the first 11 chapters. See, in the first 11 chapters, really what's happening is Paul is teaching us doctrine. We can really describe chapters 1 to 11 as a doctrinal textbook. Paul is focusing on and instructing us in some very key, very necessary, important theology. Okay, the things that Jesus Christ had done to earn our salvation and then offer that salvation as a free gift. Okay, Paul is laying those things out. He's explaining all of those things in depth and in detail. And he's even branding many of those things with theological terms, these beautifully rich theological terms. Terms like justification. You know, that rich word that talks about, you know, the fact that through Christ we are declared not guilty, we are justified. You know, these beautiful theological words like propitiation. Okay, so how what Christ accomplished for us has appeased God's wrath. And words like reconciliation. Because of what Christ accomplished for us, we can now have a relationship, be in fellowship with God once again. There's all these beautifully rich theological terms that Paul is explaining to us and branding with these terms. See, what Paul is explaining to us is the character of God. Okay, this is the character of God. This is the knowledge of God that we need to have. This is the truth. And we need to have this truth because this truth is going to lead to a conclusion. This truth is going to lead to application of what we're supposed to do with this truth. That is what the truth is there for. The truth is there for us to be able to make decisions. God-honoring decisions. Because a life that pleases God demands decisions that do. The decision to feed our mind with truth, that is what the therefore is there for. To feed our mind with truth, and the decision to let that truth fuel our emotions. To let that truth fuel our emotions. Now, look at the verse again. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy. Okay, this is what Paul is saying they need to look to, have a view of. They need to have a view of God's mercy in their life. The word mercy means to have compassion and to have care. And the people that Paul is speaking to have felt this in their life deeply. They have felt God's mercy in their life. In Romans chapter 11, verse 30, just before chapter 12, Paul says, you have now received mercy. Okay, you have received mercy. In verse 31, you have received mercy. You've received this. You felt this in your life. You know this. See, Paul is looking to them and saying, look, there was one time in your life when all of you were so far from God. All of you had broken God's laws. All of you had hearts that lived in rebellion to God. Okay, all of you were just so far away from God. But all of you heard the gospel. All of you heard this good news. In Romans chapter 1, verse 16, Paul says, okay, this is the gospel that I'm not ashamed of. This is why you're hearing it. It's the power to save people. And these people have heard this message from Paul. And they listened to what this message was. And so they heard some incredible truth, this profound, wonderful truth about who God is, his salvation. In Romans chapter 3, verse 23, they heard, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And all are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Jesus Christ. God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of blood to be received by faith. See, they heard this from Paul. They listened to this. They listened to things like when Paul in Romans 5:8 said, but God demonstrated his love for us in this, that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. See, all of you heard the message. All of you listened to this, and the majority of you accepted by faith this message. Romans 10:13 says, anyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And many of you declared with your mouth, Jesus is Lord. And you believed in your heart that God raised you from the dead. Because it is with your heart that you believe and are justified. It is with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved. Romans 10, verse 9 and 10. See, many of you have done this. And those of you that have, all of you, have felt God's mercy. All of you have felt God's mercy. Emotions were activated by the truth. Emotions were activated by the truth. See, they needed to fuel their mind or feed their mind with truth first. How often do we make a decision? And we've made a decision without having the whole truth and nothing but the truth. And then without having the whole truth and nothing but the truth, making a decision, we got to go back and we got to apologize about that. Because finally the facts that we have come and we realize that we've made a mistake. That's the plot line of dozens and dozens of sitcoms, who just want to give us a laugh. Something happened because someone didn't have all their information and it was funny and we laughed, but so often it's embarrassing and it's something that we got to apologize for. We're horrified by our decision. See, they needed to feed their mind with truth first, and then their emotions were activated by that truth. And that's important. That is important. We need to be careful that we don't ignore our emotions. Emotions are very important. And we don't want to just push those to the side and be ignorant of them, but we also need to understand them properly. Emotions need to be activated by the truth. But emotions are important. You know, we are created in the image of God. Genesis teaches us that. We are created in the image of God. And being created in the image of God doesn't merely mean that we can reflect God's character. And it does mean that. And that's the most important, significant aspect of that. You know, image bearers should, present the image, should reflect God's character. But it doesn't merely mean that. It also means that, like God, we feel emotions deeply. God feels emotions. And God feels emotions more purely and deeply than anybody else. And as we read through the scripture, we can see examples of just God feeling emotions, purely and deeply. Some examples of that are, God gets angry. He feels that emotion of anger. In the book of Romans, chapter 1, verse 18, it says that, God's wrath, his anger is poured out onto wickedness and godlessness. Okay, God gets angry about that. We see God feeling anguish, like this internal agony. In Matthew chapter 26, verse 37, Jesus, God the Son, is in the Garden of Gethsemane before going to his death, and he's feeling anguish. He's feeling this agony inside him. Deeply, he's feeling that. God feels desire. In James chapter 4, verse 5, it says that God longs for things to be happening in our life as his followers. God hates things. He feels hatred. So in Psalm chapter 5, verse 5, the psalmist says, okay, God hates wrongdoing. I mean, he hates it when people act inappropriately and rebel because of all what that means for the relationship with him, but also the consequences for others. God feels hatred, and God feels joy. There's another example. In Zephaniah 3, chapter 17, it says that God rejoices over his people with singing. I mean, that's an incredible thought to have. We often think that we're the ones singing to God, but that verse teaches us that God feels joy over us. He rejoices over us with singing. Those are just a few examples of God feeling deeply. See, God feels emotions deeply, and we do too. And yet what becomes apparent in what Paul is teaching these people in Romans chapter 12 is that truth comes first. See, truth comes first. And so when your emotions are activated by truth, then your emotions are accurate. Okay, you felt God's mercy. You feel that, but they're also helpful. Emotions can be helpful for us. And here's one reason why, one very important reason why. Emotions have been found to reinforce truth. Emotions reinforce truth. Emotions solidify truth. Emotions can cement and cast in stone truth. And so as we get truth, our emotions can reinforce that truth, can root that truth into our life. And so emotions are that powerful and that important. And yet with that comes a warning. And here's the warning. See, if your emotions are formed by a lie, if your emotions are formed by something that's not true, if your emotions are formed by something that you shouldn't think about, that you shouldn't believe in, then those same emotions are going to reinforce that. Whatever we allow into our minds, whatever we take in and accept, our emotions are going to reinforce. You know, do we ever see that today? Do you ever see that today? You know, people like believing things, and maybe even sometimes in a church setting, you know, they're believing some things, and we hear what this belief is, and we start thinking, man, have they thought about that? Are they thinking about this? Well, and the fact of the matter is probably just their emotions that reinforce that belief, that grab that belief and forge this into their life. It wasn't about thinking, it was about their emotions. They had an emotional experience, and they took something, and their emotions rooted that in their life. See, do we ever see that? Do we ever see examples of this? You know, maybe like just emotional people, you know, screaming these things and these beliefs in the faces of others that are so contrary to the things that God would say are true. But these emotions have been felt so incredibly deeply that they've cemented a belief to the point where that belief maybe even seems unbreakable. See, if our emotions aren't fueled by truth, they're going to reinforce those lies. If our emotions aren't fueled by the truth, then they're just going to reinforce those lies. And so it's so important that our emotions are fueled by truth, that it's the truth of God's word that activates our emotions. You know, that's how powerful our emotions are. That is what they do. But there's also another example, another reason for why emotions are so powerful. And this is why. For the most part, the decisions we make are emotional. The majority of the decisions we make are based on our emotions. Our decisions are largely emotional. A number of years ago, a neuroscientist named Antonio Dawario did this really fascinating research on the brain. Of course, he's a neuroscientist, and so he's studying the science of the brain. And he studied people who had brain damage in the area of their brain that controlled their emotions. You know, that emotional center of their brain. If there was damage done to it, then he studied these people. He researched these people. And he learned something incredibly fascinating. He learned that the people who had brain damage in their emotional centers could not make decisions. They could not make decisions. And that just proved the fact that the majority of our decisions are emotional. And so Paul doesn't ignore this. I mean, Paul doesn't ignore their emotions. Okay, first of all, he activates thinking, he activates truth, then he activates feeling. And he does those things because he knows that eventually what will come from that are the actions that are appropriate. So he says, therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy. Therefore, I urge you, sisters, in view of God's mercy. A life that pleases God demands decisions that do. The decision, first of all, to feed your mind with truth, and then to let that truth fuel your emotions. And then finally, to offer your life freely. the decision to offer your life freely. Listen to what Paul says at the end of this verse. He says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." To offer yourself freely, to offer your life freely, demands the decision to live sacrificially. To make those choices every single time, to lay down your personal desires, and to lay down those selfish pursuits, to die to yourself so that you could live for something greater, so you can live for God who is greater. In Colossians chapter 1, verse 10, Paul says, live your life worthy of the Lord, worthy of God, because that is what's going to please Him. And so we make the choice every single day. We make that decision to live sacrificially. And to offer your life freely demands the decision to live holy. To make the decision every single time to pursue righteousness. To kill those things in your life that pull you away from God. Okay, we kill those things and we pursue righteousness. Every single time we make the choice to pursue what is right. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2 to 3, Paul says, holiness, that is what is going to please God, your personal holiness. And so to offer our life demands the decision to every day live holy, to every day live and pursue righteousness. And to offer your life freely means the decision to live acceptably. To make the decision every single time to make God obvious in your life. As obvious as the smile that you want to see Him have on it from how it is that you're living. In Romans 12, verse 1, near the end, it says, true and proper worship. Some translations are going to say acceptable service. And that we live a life that is acceptable. Every time, every decision we make throughout the day, that we choose to make God obvious in our life in such a way that the smile on His face becomes obvious because of our decisions, every single time, every choice to live acceptably. In 2 Corinthians 5, verse 9, Paul says, make it your goal to please the Lord. Make it your goal, please the Lord. Make that your view. That's got to be the view. That's the bigger and best view. That is the view we need to look to please God in our life. And so we make the decision to feed our mind with truth. And we make the decision to let that truth fuel our emotions. And we make the decision to offer our life freely. Because then we can answer the question, why did you do that? Why did you do that? Okay, we know the answer. We can answer it. Because a life that pleases God demands decisions that do. To live a life that pleases God, make decisions that do. Every single time, make the right decision. God, today, we got a lot of decisions to make. Every day, thousands of decisions we make. And it only takes one to cause consequences, to cause problems. You know, the first and ultimate decision to make is who it is we look to. And so I pray that today, whoever's watching this, whoever's looking to us, I pray that they made that first and ultimate decision to look to you, to put their faith in you, and then to have that view in their life to please you. The Bible says that we're all going to stand before you one day and have to give an account of the lives that we lived. You can't be ignorant of that. We need to understand that the view is to please you. And God, when we make that first and ultimate decision to please you, we know that all the little decisions in life need to verify that. And so God, I pray that we would make the decision to feed our mind with truth. The truth of your character and who you are is so important. God, we need to know you. We need to know how great you are, that great gift of salvation that you brought to us and what that means to us. We need to know the truth, the black and white truth of your character and who you are in our life. And then, God, we need to make the decision to let that truth fuel our emotions, because our emotions are so powerful. I mean, our emotions, grab our ideas and they make them beliefs. They take information and they plant them into our life as factual things. And so we need our emotions to be fueled by what the truth is, not lies, not deceptions, not things that are contrary to the things that you say are good. We need to let our emotions be fueled by that, because we make decisions often on our emotions, and they need to be healthy emotions, proper emotions, accurate and helpful. And God, we need to make the decision every day to offer our life freely to you, to lay down ourselves, to kill off things that distract us from looking and seeing you, and to live a life that every day we decide, I'm yours. I'm yours. And to ensure that every decision we make verifies that. Every decision we make just points to that big ultimate one, that we're going to please you, that our lives will please God. When someone asks, why did you do that? We know why. We have the answer. Because my life is going to please God. And so my decisions will. God, help us today to see that view in our life of pleasing you. And to make each and every decision, each and every choice that we need to make, verify that. We would have lives that please you. So that when we do see you one day and we do come face to face with you, we can say, the reason I did that is because, God, I wanted to please you. My desire was to please you with every choice. God, help us to see that view today. And we pray these things in your name. Amen. Thank you for being with us this morning. When we're often in our building on a Sunday morning, we say that the desire of our church is that, one, you were encouraged, and two, that you were challenged. Ultimately, that through that you've been pointed to Jesus Christ in your life, that we get a bigger, better view of him in our life for the day-to-day. And I pray that today, as you've met with us, as you've opened God's word with us, that view has become more clear. Our prayer is that it has, and that you live a life that pleases God.